maximize suffering during the journey. Horses dragged him through the cobbled streets from Westminster to Smithfield, his body bouncing over stones, accumulating cuts and bruises that would be the least of his suffering. At Smithfield, before a crowd estimated in contemporary accounts at several thousand, the ritual of dismemberment began. The executioner, whose name history has not preserved, but whose skill was renowned throughout England, first placed the noose around Wallace's neck. The hanging was carefully calculated, enough to cause strangulation and pain, but not enough to cause death. Wallace was cut down while still conscious, his body convulsing from oxygen deprivation. What followed tested the boundaries of human endurance. Still alive and aware, Wallace watched as the executioner made the first cuts for disembowelment. Walter of Gisborough records that Wallace's entrails were removed and burned before his eyes, the smoke and stench filling his nostrils as his life ebbed away. The castration that accompanied this process was both practical, removing the means of producing heirs, and symbolic, unmanning the Scottish hero in the most literal sense. Only after this prolonged agony was Wallace finally beheaded, the merciful blow that ended his suffering. But even in death, his body served Edward's purposes. The quartering that followed was performed with surgical precision, each limb severed at joints to create 4 equal portions. The head was parboiled to preserve it, then mounted on a spike above London Bridge, where it remained for years as a warning to all who entered the city. The disposal of Wallace's remains revealed the calculated nature of medieval political messaging. Each quarter of his body was dispatched to a different Scottish town that had supported his rebellion. Newcastle upon Tyne received the right arm, a grim reminder to the border region of the price of resistance. Berwick, the first Scottish town to fall to Edward's armies, received the left arm. Stirling, site of Wallace's greatest victory, was sent a leg, while Perth received the remaining quarter. This distribution served multiple purposes beyond mere intimidation. It transformed Wallace's body into a network of terror. His physical presence extending across the borderlands as a constant reminder of English power. Local populations were forced to confront daily the consequences of defying Edward I, while English garrisons could point to the rotting flesh as proof of their king's inevitable justice. The chronicler John Barber, writing decades later, recorded the popular reaction to these displays. In many locations, the remains became pilgrimage sites for Scottish patriots who would secretly pray before the decomposing flesh of their martyred hero. This transformation of state terror into religious devotion represented a complete subversion of Edward's intentions, though it would take generations to fully manifest. Wallace's execution marked a crucial development in English legal concepts of treason. Though the formal statute of treasons would not be enacted until 1351, the precedent established by his death helped define the crime of high treason for centuries to come. The specific brutality of hanging, drawing, and quartering became the standard punishment for those who challenged royal authority. Legal scholars trace the evolution of this punishment through earlier cases, particularly the execution of Dafydd of Grid in 1283, the first recorded instance of the full ritual. Dafydd, the last native prince of Wales, had been subjected to the same dismemberment, establishing the template that would be applied to Wallace and countless others. The systematic nature of the punishment reflected its origins in Norman legal traditions, but its application to cases of treason represented a distinctly English innovation. Court records from Edward's reign revealed the careful consideration given to execution methods. The king personally reviewed sentences for major political prisoners, often specifying particular aspects of their deaths. In Wallace's case, Edward reportedly insisted on the public nature of the disembowelment, understanding that the visual impact would far exceed any written account. Edward I's calculated brutality achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than crushing Scottish resistance, Wallace's martyrdom became a rallying cry for future generations. Robert the Bruce, watching from exile, understood that Wallace's death had transformed Scottish independence from a political goal into a sacred cause. The very extremity of the punishment had elevated Wallace beyond the status of a mere rebel leader. Contemporary chronicles from Scotland describe supernatural omens associated with Wallace's death. The Scala Chronica records strange lights seen over Stirling on the night of his execution, while other sources mention animals refusing to eat near the locations where his remains were displayed. Whether these accounts reflect genuine belief or deliberate propaganda, they demonstrate how quickly Wallace's death acquired religious significance. The transformation of Wallace from historical figure to legendary hero began almost immediately. Within a generation, stories of his life had acquired mythical elements that would eventually culminate in Blind Harry's epic poem, The Wallace, in the 1470s. This literary treatment, while historically inaccurate in many details, captured the emotional truth of Wallace's legacy, that his terrible death had made him immortal in Scottish memory. In the spring of 1428, the village of Domremy existed on the razor's edge between French and Burgundian territories. The H-100 Red Years' War had transformed the French countryside into a patchwork of competing loyalties, where survival often depended on correctly guessing which army would arrive next. Into this chaos stepped a peasant girl named Joan, daughter of Jack d'Arc, whose visions would ultimately shake the foundations of medieval. The dismemberment of William Wallace in 1305, the burning of Joan of Arc in 1431, and the beheading of Conradin in 1268 were not simply punishments. They were messages. Each execution targeted more than the individual. Wallace's body shattered Scottish defiance. Joan Flame's silence divine rebellion, and Conradin's blood ended a dynasty. These deaths reveal how medieval power made examples not just of people, but of the ideals they embodied. Resistance, sanctity, and hereditary right through the deliberate destruction of the human form. Welcome to the journals of history and death as theater, executions, and power in the medieval world. William Wallace emerged from the lesser nobility of Renfrewshire in the late 13th century when Scotland writhed under English occupation. His father, Alan Wallace, held modest lands near Paisley, placing the family among the minor landholders who formed Scotland's backbone. The young Wallace witnessed firsthand the systematic humiliation of his homeland after Edward I's invasion of 1296, when English garrisons occupied Scottish castles and English officials replaced Scottish administrators with methodical efficiency. The spark that ignited Wallace's rebellion came in May 1297 when William Heslig, Sheriff of Lanark, allegedly murdered Wallace's lover, Marion Bradfoot. The historical record remains murky on precise details, but contemporary chronicles agree that Wallace responded with immediate and savage violence. He stormed Lanark with a small band of followers, cornering Heslig in his own courthouse. Wallace's sword found the sheriff's neck, and the head that had imposed English law upon Scottish soil rolled across the wooden floor. Word of Heslig's execution spread through Scotland like wildfire across dry heather. Within weeks, thousands of common Scots, farmers, craftsmen, minor nobles, abandoned their fields and workshops to join Wallace's growing army. They came armed with agricultural tools transformed into weapons, scythes sharpened into pikes, hammers weighted for skull-crushing, kitchen knives bound to long poles. Edward I had underestimated the fury that years of occupation had bred in Scottish hearts. On September 11, 1297, Wallace and his co-commander Andrew Moore positioned their forces on the northern bank of the River Forth, overlooking the narrow stone bridge at Stirling. Facing a vastly superior English force under the Earl of Surrey and Hugh Cressingham, Wallace waited until exactly half the English army had crossed the narrow bridge before launching his attack. The English cavalry, trapped on marshy ground with no room to maneuver, was systematically slaughtered. Cressingham himself was killed and flayed, his skin supposedly used to make a belt for Wallace's sword, a detail recorded by multiple contemporary chroniclers, including Walter of Gisborough. This victory sent shockwaves through Edward's court. The king campaigning in Flanders rushed back to deal personally with this upstart who had dared to humiliate English arms. Wallace had proven that English power could be broken, that their seemingly invincible heavy cavalry could be destroyed by Scottish spearmen fighting on their own soil. After his defeat at Folk in 1298, Wallace became a hunted man. Edward I placed an enormous bounty on his head, equivalent to hundreds of pounds in medieval currency, a fortune that could purchase entire estates. For 7 years, Wallace evaded capture, becoming a symbol of defiance that Edward found increasingly intolerable. The betrayal came, as it so often did, from within. Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish nobleman who had submitted to Edward, lured Wallace to Glasgow under the pretense of safe passage. On August 5, 1305, near Rob Royston, Menteith's men seized the Guardian of Scotland. The chronicle accounts describe Wallace as offering no resistance, perhaps understanding that his capture was inevitable and preferring to face his fate with dignity. The journey to London took weeks, during which Wallace was displayed like a trophy through English towns. Crowds gathered to see the man who had terrorized English forces for nearly a decade. Contemporary accounts describe him as maintaining a proud bearing throughout the humiliation, never begging for mercy or renouncing his cause. Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305 witnessed a judicial process that was as much political theater as legal proceeding. Wallace stood before his accusers wearing a crown of oak leaves, a mockery of his claim to defend Scottish sovereignty. The charges read against him were comprehensive: treason against King Edward, homicide, sacrilege for his attacks on churches, arson, and robbery. Wallace's response, recorded by multiple sources, including the Chronicle of Lannost, was defiant. "I cannot be treasonous to Edward, for I was never his subject." This statement struck at the heart of the legal fiction underlying the proceedings. Edward claimed feudal superiority over Scotland, but Wallace rejected this entirely, maintaining that he owed no allegiance to the English crown. The sentence pronounced upon Wallace represented the full horror of medieval justice. Sir Peter Maller, the presiding judge, condemned him to be drawn from the Palace of Westminster to the Tower of London, and from the Tower to Oldgate. And so through the city to Elms at Smithfield, and for your robberies, homicides, and felonies, that you be hanged, and drawn, and quartered, and beheaded, and that your head be placed on London Bridge, and your quarters be sent to Newcastle upon Tyne, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, there to remain as an example to all who pass by and behold them. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned grey and humid over London. Wallace was stripped naked and bound to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to Europe. Joan's first recorded vision occurred when she was 13 in her father's garden. She later testified that the Archangel Michael appeared to her in a blaze of light accompanied by Saints Margaret and Catherine. These celestial messengers delivered a command that would have seemed impossible to anyone familiar with medieval social hierarchies. She was to drive the English from French soil and see the Dauphin crowned as rightful king at Rheims Cathedral. The journey from Dom Remy to the court at Chinon represented a transformation that defied every convention of medieval society. Joan convinced her uncle Durin Lassuis to escort her to the local garrison commander Robert de Baudrier. When Baudrier initially dismissed her claims, Joan persisted with a combination of religious fervor and political intelligence that gradually wore down his resistance. Her accurate prediction of French defeats at the Battle of the Herrings in February 1429 finally convinced him to provide her with an escort to the Dauphin's court. The Siege of Orleans in 1429 had become a symbol of French decline. The city controlled the crucial Louis Crossing, and its fall would open central France to English conquest. When Joan arrived at the French camp, she found an army demoralized by months of failed assaults and dwindling supplies. Her presence transformed the psychological atmosphere almost instantly. Contemporary accounts described Joan's effect on French morale as nothing short of miraculous. The chronicler Jean Chartier, who witnessed her arrival, wrote that soldiers who had been preparing to abandon the siege suddenly spoke of victory as inevitable. Joan's combination of religious authority and tactical insight provided exactly what the dispirited French forces needed. The assault on the Terrell fortress on May 7, 1429 demonstrated Joan's unique leadership style. Leading from the front, she was struck by a crossbow bolt that penetrated her shoulder, the wound visible to hundreds of soldiers. Rather than retreating, she pulled out the bolt herself, had the wound dressed, and returned to the assault. The sight of their teenage commander bleeding but undaunted drove the French troops to extraordinary efforts. The liberation of Orleans sent shockwaves throughout Europe. English forces that had seemed invincible for decades suddenly appeared vulnerable. The rapid succession of French victories that followed Hohenstaufen transformed the strategic balance of the war. Most significantly, these victories opened the road to Rheims, where the Dauphin was crowned Charles VII on July 17, 1429, with Joan standing beside him in full armor. Joan's capture at Campigny on May 23, 1430 resulted from a combination of tactical overconfidence and political betrayal. Leading a sortie against Burgundian forces besieging the town, she was cut off when the city gates closed prematurely, whether through panic or deliberate treachery. John of Luxembourg, a Burgundian captain, took her prisoner and immediately recognized the political and financial opportunities her capture presented. The negotiations for Joan's transfer to English custody revealed the complex web of medieval political relationships. The English desperately wanted Joan in their hands, understanding that her continued existence threatened their claims to French legitimacy. The University of Paris, dominated by English sympathizers and Burgundian allies, provided the legal pretext by formally requesting her transfer for trial on charges of heresy and witchcraft. The price of Joan's transfer, 10,000 gold crowns plus annual pensions for John of Luxembourg and his subordinates, represented a fortune in medieval terms. This transaction transformed Joan from prisoner of war into commodity, her body literally purchased for the political purposes of her enemies. The English understood that executing Joan as a common prisoner would only enhance her martyrdom. Branding her as a heretic would destroy her religious authority. The trial that began in Rouen on January 9, 1431 represented one of the most thoroughly documented legal proceedings of the medieval period. Pierre Cossong, Bishop of Bet, presided over a tribunal that included 131 judges, assessors, and legal advisors. The surviving trial records preserved in both Latin and French versions provide an unprecedented window into medieval inquisitorial procedure. The charges against Joan encompassed far more than simple heresy. The formal indictment accused her of witchcraft, divination, blasphemy, and crucially violating divine law by wearing male clothing. This last charge reflected deep medieval anxieties about gender roles and social order. By assuming male dress and military command, Joan had transgressed boundaries that many considered divinely ordained. Joan's responses during the trial revealed both her intelligence and her unwavering conviction. When asked whether she believed herself to be in God's grace, she delivered one of the most famous answers in judicial history. "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." This response demonstrated remarkable theological sophistication, as directly claiming to be in God's grace would have been blasphemous, while denying it would have implied damnation. The political dimensions of the trial became increasingly apparent as the proceedings continued. English officials led by the Earl of Warwick pressured Cossong to expedite the process and ensure a guilty verdict. When Joan's responses proved too clever for easy condemnation, the judges resorted to increasingly technical theological arguments about the nature of divine revelation and ecclesiastical authority. On May 24, 1431, in the cemetery of Saint-Cyr Abbey, Joan faced the ultimate test of her conviction. Confronted with a PY already prepared for her execution, she was offered one final opportunity to recant her claims and submit to church authority. The document she signed renounced her visions as false, admitted her errors in wearing male clothing, and submitted completely to church authority. In return, her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. This moment of human weakness, far from diminishing Joan's historical stature, actually enhances it by emphasizing her mortality. For 3 days, she remained in her cell wearing female clothing, apparently resigned to spending the remainder of her life in prison. But on May 28, something changed. The exact catalyst remains disputed. Some sources suggest English guards attempted to rape her, others that she was given male clothing and resumed wearing it in defiance of her abjuration. Joan's resumption of male clothing provided the legal pretext Cossong needed to declare her a relapsed heretic. Under canon law, those who returned to their errors after formal abjuration faced mandatory death. When confronted about her change of clothing, Joan's response revealed that her moment of weakness had passed. I have done nothing against God or the faith, notwithstanding the abjuration which I made. The final interrogation sessions held on May 28th and 29th show Joan fully restored to her earlier defiance. She declared that her voices had returned stronger than ever, reproaching her for her temporary weakness, but promising salvation if she remained steadfast. Most significantly, she explicitly retracted her abjuration, stating that she had signed it only from fear of the fire. This return to defiance sealed Joan's fate, but also restored her spiritual authority. The judges, who had briefly hoped to save her life while destroying her reputation, now faced the necessity of execution. The very fact that Joan had briefly wavered and then recovered her courage made her final stance more powerful, not less. She had proven herself capable of human fear, but ultimately transcendent of it. The morning of May 30th, 1431, dawned clear and warm over Rouen marketplace. The quay had been constructed with meticulous attention to detail, built high enough to prevent any possibility of rescue, but designed to burn slowly to maximize suffering. Surrounding the execution site, English soldiers formed concentric rings to contain the crowd and prevent any attempt at rescue. Joan was led to the stake wearing a simple white shift, her head shaved according to standard practice for heretics. Brother Isambard de la Pierre later testified that she maintained her composure until the moment she saw the flames, when she began to weep and call upon Jesus. The executioner Geoffrey Treage later confessed that he had never presided over a more difficult burning, as Joan's obvious innocence troubled his conscience. The actual burning proceeded with horrifying deliberation. Unlike quick executions designed to minimize suffering, burning for heresy was intended to provide time for final repentance while demonstrating the purifying power of fire. Contemporary accounts describe Joan continuing to call upon Jesus and the saints even as the flames reached her body, her voice remaining strong until smoke inhalation finally silenced her. The executioner himself later stated that he had never seen anyone die with such faith, and that he feared for his own salvation, having killed so holy a person. The English authorities' treatment of Joan's remains revealed their understanding of martyrdom's power. Rather than allowing her body to be buried where it might become a pilgrimage site, they ordered the ashes gathered and thrown into the Seine. This disposal method, commonly used for heretics, aimed to prevent the collection of relics that might sustain her cult. But even this precaution proved insufficient. Within hours of the execution, rumors circulated that people had secretly gathered fragments of Joan's clothing or pieces of wood from the quay. The English began a systematic investigation to recover these potential relics, offering rewards for information and threatening punishment for concealment. The very intensity of their efforts demonstrated how completely they had failed to discredit Joan through her trial and execution. Contemporary chronicles described the immediate aftermath of Joan's death as a period of growing unease among English forces in France. Soldiers reported supernatural visitations, while military commanders found their troops increasingly reluctant to engage French forces. The psychological impact of executing a 19-year-old girl, regardless of legal justifications, undermined English morale in ways that no military defeat could have achieved. Within weeks of Joan's execution, questions about the legality of her trial began circulating among canonical scholars. The rehabilitation trial initiated by Charles Iith in 1455 eventually involved 115 witnesses and produced a devastating indictment of the original proceedings. The rehabilitation judges found systematic violations of church law, including improper venue, biased judges, and denial of proper legal representation. The theological implications of Joan's case extended far beyond questions of individual guilt or innocence. Her claim to direct divine revelation challenged the Church's monopoly on supernatural authority, while her military success suggested God's approval of her mission. The execution had been intended to resolve these theological tensions, but instead it amplified them by creating a martyr whose cult proved impossible to suppress. The broader context of medieval heresy trials provides crucial perspective on Joan's case. Unlike other famous heretics such as Marguerite Porret, who was burned in 1310 for her mystical writings, Joan combined religious claims with political and military action. This combination made her uniquely dangerous to established authorities as her divine mandate threatened both secular and ecclesiastical hierarchies. The use of fire as the method of execution carried specific theological significance in medieval culture. Unlike other forms of capital punishment, burning was understood as a form of purification intended to cleanse the soul even as it destroyed the body. The choice of this method for Joan reflected the genuine belief among her judges that they were saving her soul by destroying her earthly existence. In the autumn of 1267, 16-year-old Conradin of Hohenstaufen stood at the gates of destiny in his castle at Hohenschwangau. The last male heir of the most powerful dynasty in medieval Europe faced a choice that would determine not merely his own fate, but the future of imperial authority in Italy. Behind him lay the security of his Swabian inheritance. Ahead lay the crown of Sicily and almost certain death. The Hohenstaufen legacy weighed heavily on young shoulders. His grandfather Frederick II had been called Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, a ruler whose intellectual brilliance and political ambition had terrified popes and kings across Europe. His father Conrad IV had died fighting to maintain Hohenstaufen claims in Italy, leaving Conradin as the sole surviving heir to an empire that stretched from Germany to Sicily. But empires built on personal charisma and military force prove fragile when their creators die. Pope Clement IV, recognizing the mortal threat that Hohenstaufen power posed to papal temporal authority, had invested Charles of Anjou with the crown of Sicily in 1266. This investiture represented more than a simple change of dynasty. It marked the papacy's determination to eliminate Hohenstaufen influence permanently. The summons to Italy came from Conradin's remaining supporters, German knights and Italian Ghibellines who refused to accept Angevin rule. Their letters, preserved in Vatican archives, paint a desperate picture of resistance on the verge of collapse. Without Hohen leadership, the imperial cause in Italy would die. But with it, Conradin himself might perish. Conradin's decision to invade Italy in 1267 revealed both the romantic idealism of youth and the political realities of medieval inheritance. At 16, he possessed the theoretical right to rule an empire, but lacked the practical experience to understand the forces arrayed against him. His small army of German knights and Italian allies represented formidable fighting power, but could never match the resources Charles of Anjou commanded as papal champion. The journey south through Italy became a series of minor triumphs that masked underlying strategic weakness. Cities opened their gates to Conradin, not from genuine loyalty to Hohenstaufen claims, but from hatred of Angevin taxation and administration. These tactical successes created an illusion of strength that encouraged Conradin to press forward toward the decisive confrontation he was unprepared to win. Contemporary chroniclers described the young king's bearing during this campaign as remarkably mature for his age. Bomeo Dino Castro, writing from Sicily, reported that Conradin conducted himself with the dignity of a true sovereign, showing particular concern for the welfare of his supporters. This personal nobility, while admirable, also contributed to his downfall by preventing the ruthless calculation that successful medieval warfare demanded. The approach to Rome in the summer of 1268 marked the high point of Conradin's fortunes. The city's population, traditionally hostile to papal authority, welcomed him with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Hohenstaufen eagle might soar again over the eternal city. August 23, 1268 dawned hot and humid over the plain of Tallio, east of Rome. The armies that faced each other represented more than competing dynastic claims. They embodied fundamentally different visions of European political order. Conradin's forces, predominantly German knights, reinforced by Italian Ghibellines, fought for the traditional imperial concept of universal monarchy. Charles of Anjou's army, blessed by papal authority and financed by French gold, represented the emerging alliance between secular monarchy and ecclesiastical power. The initial phases of battle seemed to vindicate Conradin's confidence in German military prowess. His heavy cavalry, employing tactics perfected in decades of warfare along the eastern frontier, smashed through Angevin lines with devastating efficiency. Charles himself barely escaped capture, his royal standard torn from the hands of his fleeing bodyguard. But Charles of Anjou had not conquered Sicily through military incompetence. As Conradin's forces pursued the apparently routed enemy, Charles launched his reserve, a hidden force of French knights who struck the scattered Germans from behind. The tactical reversal was complete and catastrophic. Within hours, Conradin's army ceased to exist as an organized force. The young king's personal courage during the collapse of his cause impressed even his enemies. Rather than fleeing immediately, he attempted to rally his remaining knights for a final charge that might have broken through to safety. Only when this desperate gambit failed did he accept the advice of his companions and attempt to escape. The week following, Taliesin witnessed one of medieval history's most poignant pursuits. Conradin, accompanied by a small band of loyal knights, including his cousin Frederick of Bardon, and the Infante Henry of Castile, attempted to reach the coast, where Pisan ships waited to carry them to safety. Their route led through the Apennine Mountains, terrain that favored fugitives but also harbored bandits and Charles's agents. The betrayal that ended Conradin's freedom came like so many medieval disasters from trusted allies. Giovanni Frangipane, Lord of Ora, had sworn fealty to the Hohenstaufen cause and offered his castle as sanctuary. Instead, he delivered his guests to Charles of Anjou's representatives, trading Conradin's life for Anjou gold and papal favor. Rather than raging against Frangipane's treachery, he reportedly accepted his fate with resignation, as if understanding that his death had been inevitable from the moment he crossed the Alps. This stoic acceptance reflected both his noble upbringing and perhaps an intuitive understanding of the forces that had doomed his cause. The journey to Naples as Charles's prisoner provided Conradin with ample time to contemplate his situation. Unlike Wallace, who maintained defiance to the end, or Joan, who drew strength from divine visions, Conradin faced his fate with the fatalism of someone who understood that his death served purposes larger than personal vengeance. The legal proceedings that condemned Conradin revealed the fundamental transformation of medieval political authority. Unlike traditional feudal justice, which recognized the rights of noble birth and personal honor, Charles's tribunal operated according to newer concepts of treason and state security. Conradin stood accused not merely of rebellion, but of threatening the divinely ordained order established by papal authority. The charges read against the young king encompassed both traditional feudal crimes and emerging concepts of political legitimacy. His invasion of papal territory constituted not merely trespass, but sacrilege against the visu of Christ. His claim to the Sicilian crown represented not dynastic inheritance, but usurpation of authority bestowed by God through his papal representative. Conradin's defense delivered with dignity that impressed even as judges rested on traditional concepts of hereditary right and imperial authority. He argued that his claims to Sicily and the empire derived from his grandfather Frederick II, who had received them through legitimate succession from earlier emperors. This defense, while legally sound according to traditional feudal law, ignored the revolutionary changes that had transformed European political theory. The tribunal's verdict was predetermined, but the legal reasoning employed to justify it marked a crucial development in medieval jurisprudence. By treating Conradin's dynastic claims as treasonous usurpation, Charles established precedents that would echo through centuries of European legal development. The divine right of kings, properly blessed by ecclesiastical authority, trumped all traditional feudal obligations. The morning of October 29, 1268, dawned gray and cold over Naples's Porta del Mercato. The scaffold erected for Conradin's execution had been built with careful attention to symbolic detail, elevated above the crowd, but not so high as to diminish the visual impact. It provided perfect sightlines for the thousands of spectators who had gathered to witness the end of the Hohenstaufen line. Conradin approached his death with composure that amazed contemporary observers. Dressed in simple but dignified clothing, he climbed the scaffold steps without assistance, his bearing so noble that even Charles's supporters felt momentary doubt about the justice of his execution. The contrast between his youth and the gravity of his fate moved many spectators to tears. The final moments of Conradin's life acquired legendary status, even as they unfolded. In a gesture that embodied the chivalrous ideals of his era, he removed his glove and threw into the crowd, reportedly crying, "Let someone carry this to my relatives so they may know how I died." The symbolism was unmistakable. The glove represented not surrender, but defiance, a pledge that his death would be avenged. The executioner's blow, delivered with professional precision, severed Conradin's head cleanly from his body. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd's reaction as stunned silence, broken only by the weeping of women and the prayers of priests. Even Charles's soldiers seemed subdued by what they had witnessed, understanding perhaps that they had participated in something that transcended ordinary military justice. The disposal of Conradin's body reflected the ambiguous nature of his execution. Unlike common criminals, whose corpses were often left to rot as warnings, Conradin received burial befitting his royal status. Yet the location chosen, a small chapel outside Naples rather than a great cathedral, suggested ongoing unease about the political implications of his death. The execution of Conradin sent shockwaves throughout medieval Europe that extended far beyond questions of dynastic succession. For the first time in centuries, a legitimate emperor had been publicly executed by a rival claiming papal authority. This unprecedented act shattered traditional assumptions about the sanctity of royal blood and the limits of political violence. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find precedents for Charles's action. The execution of kings was not unknown in medieval history, but those deaths had typically resulted from battlefield casualties, palace coups, or popular uprisings. The public trial and execution of an anointed ruler by legal process represented something entirely new and deeply troubling to medieval sensibilities. The reaction of European courts revealed the profound unease Conradin's death had generated. Even rulers who had no love for Hohenstaufen claims recognized that Charles had established a dangerous precedent. If papal authority could justify the execution of one legitimate king, what protection did any monarch enjoy against similar claims? The immediate military consequences of Conradin's death proved equally significant. German support for imperial claims in Italy evaporated overnight as potential supporters recognized the futility of challenging Charles's overwhelming advantages. The Ghibelline cause deprived of its symbolic focus fragmented into local conflicts that lacked broader political significance. Dante Alighieri's treatment of Conradin's death in the Purgatorio transformed a political execution into universal tragedy. Writing in Canto 20, Dante placed responsibility for the young king's death directly on Pope Clement IV, describing Charles as merely the instrument of papal ambition. I see the fleur de enter Ani, and in his vicar Christ made prisoner. I see him mocked a second time. I see renewed the vinegar and gall, and him slain between living thieves. This literary treatment reflected broader European sentiment about Conradin's fate. By the time Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, the young king had been transformed from political threat into innocent victim, his death serving as evidence of papal corruption rather than divine justice. The very extremity of his fate had elevated him beyond the realm of ordinary political conflict. The German Romantic tradition of the 19th century discovered in Conrad a perfect embodiment of noble defeat. Ludwig Uhlann's poem Conradin captured the tragic beauty that later generations found in his story. Das war der Hornen, that was the last of the Hohenstaufen. This literary tradition, while historically inaccurate in many details, preserved the emotional truth of Conradin's significance as the end of an era. The transformation of Conradin from historical figure to literary symbol reflected broader changes in European political consciousness. As absolute monarchy emerged in the later medieval period, the young king's fate acquired new relevance as a warning about the dangers of unchecked royal power. Regardless of its ecclesiastical sanction, with no legitimate imperial heir surviving, the Holy Roman Empire entered a period of weakness and fragmentation that would persist for generations. The Great Interregnum that followed left Germany without effective central authority, allowing regional princes to consolidate power at the expense of imperial unity. Charles of Anjou's triumph proved Pyrrhic in the longer term. His harsh rule in Sicily generated the resentment that exploded into the War of the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, when the island's population rose in coordinated rebellion against French occupation. The massacre of French colonists on Easter Monday demonstrated that Conradin's execution had created martyrdom rather than submission, his death becoming a rallying cry for Sicilian independence. The papal victory embodied in Conradin's execution also contained the seeds of later disasters. By so completely identifying with temporal power, the papacy had compromised its spiritual authority in ways that would eventually contribute to the Great Western Schism and the broader crisis of ecclesiastical credibility. Clement IV's celebration of the young king's death appeared even to contemporary observers as evidence of papal worldliness rather than divine justice. These three executions, Wallace's dismemberment, Joan's burning, and Conradin's beheading, represent the full spectrum of medieval state violence. Each death was carefully orchestrated to send specific messages about the nature of authority and the consequences of resistance. Wallace died as a traitor, his body scattered across Scotland to demonstrate English power. Joan perished as a heretic, her ashes cast into the Seine to prevent the collection of relics. Conradin fell as a user, his noble blood spilled to establish new concepts of legitimate rule. Yet in each case, the intended message was subverted by the very extremity of the punishment. Wallace became Scotland's eternal hero, his suffering transformed into a symbol of national resistance. Joan's martyrdom undermined the very ecclesiastical authority that had condemned her, eventually leading to her canonization. Conradin's death marked the beginning of centuries of German resentment against papal temporal claims, contributing ultimately to the Protestant Reformation. The bodies of these three victims became texts written in blood and fire, their meanings constantly reinterpreted by successive generations. Medieval authorities understood the power of public execution to shape political consciousness, but they consistently underestimated their audience's capacity to find heroism in suffering and sanctity in defiance. The scaffold, the stake, and the executioner's block became stages where the condemned could achieve immortality through the very act of dying.